conference on content understanding. In some sense, this is a little different because I'm going to talk about content misunderstanding. Unfortunately, for those of you who are working in content understanding, every once in a while you'll get it wrong. I want to argue that, in fact, you should try hard not to, but you will occasionally get it wrong. And that instead, when you get it wrong, and I mean not just slightly different calculation, but fundamentally wrong, you should re-examine what you're doing. What are the systemic issues that are causing that misunderstanding, and then make changes to fix those systemic problems. So, I'm going to be talking a little bit about preventing the next heartbleed. What is it? What its impact is? What would have countered it? And so on. So first, I need to define what heartbleed is. Heartbleed, first of all, depends on understanding what OpenSSL is. Modern computer systems have huge numbers of software components. Those components are made of other components and so on. One of those components, types of components that's widely used, is something called a cryptographic library, and one of the most common of those libraries is something called OpenSSL. This is a very, very widely used component to implement what's called either historically secure sockets layer, which has been more recently renamed into transport security layer. Now, these are low-level components, but anytime you use a web browser and you see the little lock symbol, that means you're using SSL or TLS. Okay, and both ends have to communicate this way. So even if you may not be aware of it, you actually use it quite a bit. Now, what is Heartbleed? Heartbleed is a vulnerability, a mistake in a particular implementation of this cryptographic system called OpenSSL. Okay, what is this? Why is this vulnerability happening? Well, it's a mistake. It's a mistake made by a developer. The vulnerability is caused by something called a buffer overread in an area of memory called the heap. Buffer overread has a CWE number, and in fact, it's a special case of another vulnerability called improper restriction of memory buffer bounds, which has its own CWE numbers. These CWE numbers hint at you that, by the way, these are widely known, well-known kinds of problems. They're the kinds of problems that people, when they talk about security vulnerabilities, they keep showing up over and over again. They're a common cause. This particular problem happened because of improper validation of a particular kind of request called a heartbeat request. Okay? This was independently found by two different organizations, by the way. One, it was found at Google, and a short time later by a company called Codenomicon. Now, what was the impact? Heartbleed's impact was actually quite large. It was actually fairly devastating. First of all, it turns out that attackers could use this vulnerability to acquire private server and client data, including something called the server private keys. That's actually devastating. In many ways, those are crown jewels. That's what with that, you can basically forge anything else. If you want to be Google for a day, great. Get its keys. You are now Google. Okay? The number of affected sites. I'm just going to read this off because I think this helps give us a sense of the scale here. Google, Facebook, YouTube, Yahoo, Bing, Pinterest, Blogspot, Instagram, Tumblr, Reddit, Netflix, Stack Overflow, let's see, keep going, GitHub, Etsy, US Postal Service, Blogger, Wikipedia, Washington Post. Okay, raise your hand if you've ever used any one of those websites. Okay, the rest of you are not awake. Okay? Hopefully I've made my point. This impacted a lot of organizations. What's worse, it turned out this particular vulnerability was trivial to attack. There's even a wonderful little cartoon I didn't put in here, which shows how easy it is to attack. And I've got some little exploitation examples down here. A particular CEO, for example, was impersonated of a UK parenting website. But one of the challenges is it's often difficult to figure out if this particular vulnerability has been exploited, which also creates all sorts of problems. But Bruce Schneider has a really nice way of summing up the potential of this. On a scale of 1 to 10, this is an 11. Okay? Now, there are some good news. Because of a really strong effort to get the word out that, hey, there's a really serious vulnerability, you need to fix it right now, There was actually a huge number of efforts within the executive branch, I know, and with a lot of other organizations to very, very rapidly repair this. So the damage from this is actually less than you might have expected for such a major vulnerability because of a lot of concerted efforts. But it's due to those concerted efforts, not because the vulnerability itself wasn't dangerous. Okay, so why wasn't Heartbleed detected earlier? I mentioned earlier that there's these CDW numbers which are assigned to common types of vulnerabilities. These are the kinds of vulnerabilities that software developers who care about security already know about. They've already been told, look for this, look for that. So why didn't they find these? Well, it turns out that a large number of widely used tools and techniques simply failed to detect this kind of vulnerability. There's a large number of tools and techniques that use an approach called static analysis. Generally, the approaches can be grouped into three categories: static, dynamic, and hybrid of the first two. And the static approaches involve analyzing software without actually running it, executing it. This can go anywhere from sitting a human down, reading the code, to various tools that do something like that, but from a computer point of view. And unfortunately, this software was so complex that it basically exceeded the capabilities of most tools used to look for software vulnerabilities using these kinds of techniques. I specifically looked at a number of commonly used tools like HP Fortify, Coverity, Clockwork, Grammatex, and none of those would have found it by default. Another approach are basically the dynamic approaches. And the dynamic approaches, you're running the program and trying to see if something wrong happens, and then trying to track down what the problem is. And hybrid approaches basically take dynamic and static and combine them together. But again, it turns out that the typical approaches for finding vulnerabilities, or understanding your content, in this case for is it vulnerable or not, completely failed. There is a big push over the last number of years for an approach called test-driven development. This has a lot of benefits. It's basically the idea of before you even implement your software, write the tests. They should fail, right? Because you didn't write the software to do it yet. Now write your program. Now it should succeed. This is actually really, really effective for helping get rid of a lot of the simple basic defects in software in terms of failed functionality. Unfortunately, these kinds of tests that are written are completely useless from a security point of view. From a security point of view, you're generally worrying about what happens when you are given wrong or misleading input. And generally, that's not what people are testing with these kinds of approaches. So they're thinking, I'm doing lots of testing. And the answer, but this is a systemic problem. You're doing a lot of testing, but none of it has anything to do with security. Oh, well, there's another approach called branch coverage, which says, how good are my tests? Did I cover, if there's a true and a false branch in software? Did I at least test once the true and test once the false? Now that can be helpful for understanding how good your testing is. However, this turns out to be useless for Heartbleed because Heartbleed fundamentally was missing code. It was a check that didn't exist. And when you forget something entirely, these kinds of coverage tools are useless. They can't detect that code isn't there. They can only detect that you tested well what was there, or at least better what was there. There's another technique called fuzz testing, which has become widely popular. Microsoft has reported really a lot of success stories with fuzz testing, which is all well and good. However, as typically applied, what fuzz testing does is send lots and lots and lots of data into a program, trying to make it basically crash. The problem with Heartbleed was that it didn't cause a crash. Heartbleed involves something called an overread. While overwrites can, in some cases, cause crashes of a program, overreads typically do not. So we have a systemic problem that, hey, we've got a lot of tools, but none of them are very good. None of the ones that we often use are good at finding these kinds of problems. So what I'm going to argue is, first of all, in this particular case, unfortunately, there's a systemic problem that we're not very good now at finding these. Now, obviously, the vulnerability was eventually found. Google actually did a thorough code examination and found it. Around the same time, CodeNovacon used an approach that was a variant of fuzz testing plus some additional interesting things, and they found it as also. But it took 2 years. We don't want it to take 2 years. We want to find these things faster. So I went around and asked lots of folks and looked at some of the research that I had available on what could find this. And I ended up finding, my current list right now is 12 different approaches that would have countered Heartbleed. And here's my list, 1 through 12. I'll briefly talk about each of these, although really for this group, the point really isn't the list, the specifics of the list. The point is that there are ways to counter systemic problems once you know that there are systemic problems, and what you need to go is look and say, what could I do to eliminate it in the future? But I'm going to talk about a couple of this because I think nothing else, it'll get the flavor of this.